Hello everybody, I'm Pontius Porcius, and welcome back to Unexpected Awesome. Last Halloween special, we talked about an underknown technical marvel of a horror film from a bygone era, and this year we're doing very much the same, from the very same well, the well of Vincent Price. In what seems to be a running theme with my channel, we're going to talk about one of his more underknown films, Diary of a Madman. Based on a novella by Guy de Maupassant called The Horla, it follows a magistrate by the name of Simon Cordier finds himself confronted by a death row inmate that he impartially judged guilty of a crime. The inmate says to him that he was forced to do so by a creature beyond his imagination, manipulating his very will and mocking his weakness. Cordier doesn't believe him because he's a rational man of science and logic. However, after the man's eyes glows green, he attacks the magistrate, and in a fit of self-defense, he slams him against the wall, killing the inmate, and feeling flustered and confused when he gets home. He begins to question what came over the man after he feeds the only true solace for his solitary loneliness, a pet left over from a past life. He notices on the wall a prized photograph of whom he asks his servants why it's there. They said they didn't put it up there, and that he must have put it up there himself. And in taking it back, he hears voices, wondering what's wrong with him. Eventually, a voice comes to him, a mocking, cruel voice that calls itself the Horla, that attests that there is evil in the heart of every single man, and that he, the Horla himself, can manipulate that and convince them to do terrible things. Simon doesn't believe him, and says to the Horla that it's a hallucination, that he would never bend to its will. He's hypnotized by the creature and kills his pet, and the very next day he sees that his pet has mysteriously died, and he sees more things moved around. The file on the convict that confronted him, an ink bottle knocked over onto that file, destroying it. He feels himself compelled once again to pursue an old hobby, the hobby of sculpting. And in the art district, he meets a young woman, a model for a very fetching painting that he notices in a window. Odette is the wife of the painter, a earnest and humble man by the name of Duclas, well loved by his associates and friends, but not remarkably successful or savvy in the business sense. He's your classic example of a starving artist, and none is more frustrated with this than his wife. A woman who lusts after a life of luxury. Our cinematic Manon informs him that she's taken a job as a model for a wealthy benefactor, that is, Simon. Simon and Odette get along extremely well in their time period, him treating her with the utmost courtesy and respect, crafting her into the countenance of a poem that he once read about a laughing, mischievous girl. Eventually, Cordier is confronted by the Horla again, who tells him that he feels a temptation in his heart, a temptation to not only betray his former family, but to wreck this woman's home and her life. He attests that's simply not true, but the Horla says that he'll make him do it. The very next several days, Cordier begins to court Odette, luring her away from her Van Gogh of a husband with the promise of wealth, luxury, and dotage. She, of course, accepts, saying that he'll be able to provide her everything that Duclas could only dream of, and that he doesn't have the ambition nor initiative to. Flustered with jealousy, he goes to confront Odette after she accepts a marriage proposal from Cordier, and very angrily leaving her house after he decides that she's not worth it, and Cordier is there. His eyes glowing green, stalking out of the shadows like a classic slasher villain, and is greeted with an initially warm welcome of Odette, soon turns into terrifying screams as he carves her lifeblood out of her. Cordier wakes up in his empty house, having sent his servants off to what would have been his honeymoon villa. He sees not only blood in his hallway, but he also sees the newspaper, saying that his paramour was found decapitated. The Horla mocks him for his weakness of will, and Simon says to him that he did not do anything wrong, that he didn't remember doing anything wrong, to which the Horla reveals that the head has been hidden inside of the sculpture. Broken, his will in shambles, the Horla throws the picture that initially indicated his presence in Cordier's life on the ground, shattering the glass in the frame, and demands that Cordier toss it into a lit fire, burning up the remains of his old life, surrendering to the Horla's will as a puppet of destruction and immorality. With the witnesses of the landlady initially seeing and hearing the argument between Duclas and Odette, the gendarmerie arrest Paul and are set to convict him. He pleads with Cordier to attest his innocence, but once again under the Horla's will, Cordier refuses and says that there's nothing he can do, that he doesn't know the facts of whether or not Duclas is innocent or not. Duclos in prison, the only person left to stand up for his innocence are his friends, which include his patron gallery owner and the gallery owner's daughter, the only woman that truly respects and cares for Duclos. She goes up to and confronts Cordier, saying that he's abusing his social power and position, and that she'll do whatever she can to get him out of prison, to find whatever scrap of evidence she can. The Horla, sensing his prize puppet being threatened, compels Cordier to hunt her down, and he does, almost succeeding in executing her, before the glint of a silver cross, like the will of God itself, banishing the darkness from his mind. He begins to ask for counsel from the priest of the church where the cross was. The invisible creature attempts to kill them both by almost running them over with a carriage. Sensing that he's not safe from the Horla and thinking past his past interactions with it, he says to the priest to get the girl and to bring her to his house. He gives them his diary in which he's written the accounts of the past several weeks, and a letter with instructions to read the journal at his funeral should he not survive the night. Enraged, the Horla storms in, demanding an explanation, attempting to badger him back into being under the Lovecraftian creature's spell. Cordier refuses and throws the lantern in the room on the ground, igniting the room. Having previously soaked the room in kerosene, locking the doors and covering over the window doors with very flammable drapes, he recounts to the creature his memories of his final insult, in which he forced him to burn up his remnants of his life, questioning him why he didn't do it himself. Perhaps he's afraid of the fire, for fire has no will of its own to dominate. And now it's the Horla's turn to feel terror and fear. Screaming in desperation, agony, and terror, the Horla is vanquished in a burst of green flame as his body is consumed by the man-made inferno. Having seen victory secured, the magistrate attempts to escape the ruin but drops the key into the open flame. Unable to recover it and unable to escape, passes out from the smoke in the room, and his entire home goes up in flames. His journal is read at his funeral, and everybody involved questions whether or not the Horla, a creature from beyond mankind's understanding, almost seemingly from hell itself, could even exist, but also agreeing that if such a creature should exist, that mankind should be ever vigilant to combat that evil. Diary of a Madman is not the most creative of films. In point of fact, it's very, very standard for the 1960s. However, despite that, it stands far and above as one of the better horror films of its decades in terms of its acting and its character writing. The characters are very few, but they're very well developed and well-rounded. The supporting cast is pretty well acted by character actors from its time period, with a lot of very relatable and well-developed people. The obvious standout amongst all of them is Paul Duclos, the humble, starving artist who sees the good in people. He is the picture of virtue, and it's his virtue and innocence that motivates the protagonist of the story to finally take a stand against evil and use his wits to defeat its awesome power. Odette Malott, the secondary protagonist of the story, is a nice little subversion of the good girl types. Unlike the protagonist of House of Wax, she is not virtuous. She is very much a seductress who concerns herself primarily with her wealth, status, and comfort. She's very much a Manon-type character. At the same time, she's not truly evil. Everybody involved with her, with the exception of the manipulated Cordier, all pretty much understand her for what she is by their treatment of her. Even her bewitched husband of her eventually realizes. The rest of the main cast isn't so much to speak home about. They all do pretty good jobs with acting out their roles, though they don't really have much characterization. The daughter of the gallery owner and the gallery owner are very good friends of the artist and stand up for him. They're much more likable people, and they serve as a good foil to Odette. You've also got the police captain, who's a good foil to the main character in the fact that he provides a much more straightforward view of justice, which sets up the question in the judge's mind about the nature of evil itself. However, where the movie's characters and dialogue and acting really shines are in its main characters. Not physically seen, the Horla is perhaps one of the more intimidating monsters I have seen from this era. An invisible creature whose only visual distinction of where and what it is the green flare in the eyes of those it puppeteers. It's an intimidating baritone voice commanding the will of the main character and the audience. Its ideas and statements and philosophies of the inherent evil nature of man is a direct contrast to the initially much more optimistic magistrate, and serves as a very devious creature, twisting everything it sees into an evil form of what it is. Which brings us to Vincent Price himself. Vincent Price was very well known as a horror character actor, primarily playing villains, such as his role in House of Wax. However, in this movie, he gets to play against type. He plays a much more romantic, heroic character, an optimistic, if not lonely man who believes in the inherent virtue of good people, and in doing so finds himself in the eyes of a creature of pure malice. His desperation and his crumbling will, seeing his entire world, both metaphorically and physically breaking down around him, pushes him to the absolute limit. However, faced with a person pursuing truth and justice despite the odds being against them, and seeing the will of God shine in his eye to tell him that he has the strength to do so, he finds himself with the will and wit to face off the creature. And in possibly one of the greatest scenes I've ever seen with Vincent Price, he finally faces off against the Horla, and in triumph defeats it. Cordier is a very good example of a tragic hero, a good man pushed to his limit with the corruptions that he faces, ultimately defeated by evil, but not before restoring his soul. As for the production value, it's very unpretentiously shot. It's all very straightforward and matter of fact. What the camera sees is what you need to see, and everything's in frame, which highlights one of the negative aspects of the film. The movie has very dated special effects. However, though, they managed to mitigate this by having the creature be invisible, demanding the actors act with nothing there, thus underlining and highlighting not only the excellent dialogue given to the man who plays the Horla, but also to Price himself for managing to convincingly portray a confused man speaking to a creature he can hear but cannot see. The visual elements of the special effects, though, are not particularly great. More often than not, the things that move by the hands of the Horla move very jerkily, as if on wires, because they were on wires. And the simple fact is the time-lapse photography they used to show the Horla's more articulate physical manipulations, it just stands out more like a sore thumb, but it's fine. Diary of a Madman is a really solid horror film, especially if you like really good acting and are a huge fan of Vincent Price. And as always, stay golden.